to catch a flight. I'm flying to Dallas, and from Dallas I'm driving 3 hours to Oklahoma to attend a workshop there. So if you have any questions about the message, please ask Neil Kang here, who's going to answer any kind of questions you've got afterwards. All right, so thank you, Neil, for volunteering for that, actually. Thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. This morning we're actually going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 1. And just so that you know that I've actually placed the whole passage in your notes this morning so that you can actually have the actual text in front of you. But before we dive into this passage, I want to know if you guys have ever considered in your life, have you ever considered what role does pain play in your walk with God? What role does pain play in your walk with God? And should you be surprised if God has good in store for you when you experience pain? Should you be surprised if God has good in store for you when you experience pain? And the reason why I ask is I recently ran across a very interesting article from the BBC titled "The Curse of People Who Never Feel Pain." And this article describes a certain number of people who have a health condition called CIP. Now, many of you doctors in this audience probably have heard of this particular condition. CIP stands for congenital insensitivity to pain. You see, CIP is a genetic disorder where people feel no pain whatsoever. So this means if you have CIP, you can actually place your hand on boiling hot water or undergo a full-blown surgery without feeling any discomfort. And this article begins telling the story of a young German man in his 20s. His name is Stefan Betz, who has CIP. And throughout his relatively young life and short life, Stefan has bitten off the tip of his tongue. He has severely shattered his right foot when he jumped off some stairs. And he actually endured a skateboard accident where he fractured his bone in his foot. And he did not feel a thing for months. And doctors say that Stefan's condition is so rare, he's amongst only a few hundred people worldwide who are estimated to have CIP. But now, due to the rise of social media, where it's easier to locate certain types of people, social media has helped medical companies find people who have CIP. And through study and research, pharmaceutical companies have learned that CIP is a mutation of a particular gene that actually regulates the pathway or channel that signals pain in a person's body. And this mutation kind of blocks that pathway. Can you imagine never feeling pain? Wouldn't you think that that would be just the greatest thing if you could never feel pain? But what I found interesting and fascinating in this BBC article is that most people with CIP consider not feeling pain to actually be a curse rather than a blessing. In fact, Stefan Betz had his skateboard accident where he fractured his bone in his foot. It later developed into a bone infection, which is now causing him to have a permanent limp in his 20s. If he didn't have CIP, he probably would have detected this years ago. And Stefan would tell you that people with CIP, and I quote, would love to know what pain means or what it feels like to be in pain so as to protect their body. You see, in the physical world, pain has purpose. Pain has purpose in the physical world. In our physical lives, pain is meant to signal that something is not right and that we get the help that we need. Now, hearing this, many of us would probably never want to have CIP in our physical lives. However, I think if we were honest, we might consider having CIP in our mental and our emotional lives. We might think it's a good thing. In fact, I think that many of us will agree that mental or emotional pain can hurt much more than certain types of physical pain we actually go through. And that having CIP in our mental or emotional lives might sound appealing. We might never want to ever feel pain in our minds and our heart. So what about pain in our emotional and mental life? Do we only feel pain in our souls to signal that something is not right with us? What role does pain play in your walk with God? And should you be surprised if God has good in store for you when you experience pain? This brings us to today's text that we'll see in 1 Samuel chapter 1, which is about an amazing woman named Hannah, starting in verse 1. You see, this is what the text says. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jerome, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He has two wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh with Hophni and Phinehas. The two sons of Eli were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of his meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. Her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? You see, the very first thing that we learn about Hannah in this passage is that Hannah is a woman with emotional pain. And Hannah's emotional pain is brought about and reinforced by 3 different sources. The first source of pain comes from the fact that Hannah cannot have a child. As we read here in verse 5, but to Hannah, Elkanah gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And we're going to come back to this in a second to discuss Hannah's situation of being childless, because I just want you guys to note that I don't think that this passage is about people who cannot get pregnant. And the reason why I don't think this is because of the phrase, the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. And again, more is coming in a little bit, but I believe that our Bible is saying that the Lord does not close all people's wombs. The second source of Hannah's pain comes from her being bullied from Elkanah's other wife, Peninnah, where we read in verse 6, because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Can you all imagine this scene where Hannah can not only have a child, but she's also being bullied along the way? And the text states that this went on year after year. And the third source of pain of Hannah comes from Hannah not being understood by her own husband. You see, we read in verse 8, her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Now, women in the audience, I would like for you to know that the biblical authors have recorded these questions from Elkanah and his mouth for a reason. Yes, the Bible indirectly is inferring that they know that we men contribute to your pain. The Bible has known this for 3,000 years. I mean, Elkanah could have at least tried harder to comfort Hannah, right? Or Elkanah could have rebuked his own other wife, Peninnah, to actually protect Hannah. The text says year after year she would provoke her. You see, the biblical authors know that we men at times just don't get it. Can I get an amen, Justy? Amen. And you'll read later that even the priest, Eli, in verse 12, accuses Hannah of being drunk. So Hannah's not even understood by her own priest. Now, did y'all happen to get the image here in your mind of what's going on? There's an image. There are 3 sources that are contributing to Hannah's pain from 3 different directions. One is from the Lord closing Hannah's womb. The second is from Hannah's peer or enemy who's taunting her. And finally, from within Hannah's nuclear family, her own husband who does not fully understand her. You see, what's unique about certain stories in the Bible is that when the Lord is involved in your pain, and when your peers or your frenemies are involved in your pain, or when your close family members are involved in your pain, you need to know that this combination does not always signal that something is wrong with you, or that something is wrong within your soul. But rather, the Bible shows that when pain comes from one of these sources, from one of these different sources, this is an invitation from God to you to find purpose through your pain. This is an invitation. Or in other words, the Bible is saying we find pain in our soul so that we can actually engage God. And the reason why I believe that this passage is pointing us in this direction of pain being an invitation is because when an ancient Israelite heard or read the phrase, the Lord had closed her womb, this image would have triggered in an Israelite's mind and memory a very long line of very well-known people whom God had a specific purpose for. The phrase, the Lord had closed her womb, was a specific pattern for the story of Israel. For example, the image of pain and barrenness was used of Sarah, who was 90 years old when Isaac, her firstborn child, was born. And the frenemy who was mocking her in her pain up until the point that she got pregnant was Hagar the slave. But her son Isaac was very important for the story of Israel because he becomes the child of Abraham's promise from Genesis chapter 12. The image of barrenness was also used of Rachel, the wife of Jacob, in Genesis chapter 30, who had to wait and watch her sister have a bunch of children. Rachel even cried out to Jacob, "Give me a child or I will die." And then Jacob, of course, like a typical husband, gets angry and says in Genesis 30, verse 2, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" You see, the Bible authors know that we husbands contribute to your wives' pain, right? So it wasn't until her sister Leah, who, by the way, was also married to Jacob, very complicated situation, by the way. Rachel's sister Leah had given birth to 7 children before the Lord remembered Rachel. And then Rachel finally gave birth to Joseph and Benjamin. But Joseph and Benjamin are 2 sons who are important for the story of Israel because they would later play a crucial role in the saving of the Israelites in Egypt. And then finally there was Samson, whose mother, who was described as a woman who was barren and unable to give birth. But she gives birth to Samson with the help of the Lord. And married women in the audience, if you want to read something very dumb, her husband says to her, just read Judges chapter 13, verses 21 to 23. Don't read that now, but read that later. Judges 13, verses 21 to 23. But Samson ends up being very important to the story of Israel because he grows up to be a judge to help the Israelites deal with the Philistines. You see, I believe that these narratives of Sarah, of Rachel, and Samson's mother are setting a pattern and are stating that these women, although they are barren, they are yet women of purpose in Israel's story, even before we get to read the full story of Hannah. So what is the Bible trying to communicate to us here? I believe the Bible is saying that painful perseverance certainly has purpose in your story as you walk with God. Painful perseverance certainly has purpose in your story as you walk with God. Last week, Lewis Shepard and Tim Rhodes and I, we took a road trip to Austin to watch the UT football game with our young sons. And on the way, as they were talking, Lewis and Tim informed me of a very well-known author and professor named Jordan Peterson. I don't know if any of you guys heard of Jordan Peterson before. I had never heard of Jordan Peterson before, but he wrote this bestseller titled 12 Rules for Life. And I cracked it open, and I read the opening of his book for the very first time. And in the opening of his book, Peterson makes a very bold claim that I believe that he got from the Bible. Peterson looks through the lens of history, such as World War II and the rise of the Nazis, and he criticizes the idea, and listen to this, that happiness is the proper goal for life. And he states that the meaning of life has more to do with the development of a person's character in the face of pain than it does with happiness. Let me just say that again. He criticizes that happiness is a proper goal for life. And he states that the meaning of life has more to do with the development of a person's character in the face of pain than it does with happiness. And you know what? I think now at my age, I totally agree with Jordan Peterson. You see, a health and wealth gospel preacher might preach that Hannah's story of prayer is about how to get happy by getting what you want in life. Just pray diligently. Look at Hannah. She just prayed diligently and she got what she wanted. This is what a health and wealth preacher might preach. But I believe that this passage, along with the other pattern stories in the Bible that I've just discussed, I believe that these are actually showing us that how Hannah becomes a woman of prayer, and through her prayer becomes a woman of character and a woman of purpose. And what you're going to see when you read verses 9 all the way to the end of the chapter is how Hannah is going to do something that most people cannot do in her situation. Hannah prays an amazing prayer that will absolutely transform her. And what you're going to notice is that Hannah's prayer is what actually brings about her very own healing, in fact. What you're going to notice in her prayer is that by the end of it, you're going to see Hannah is almost completely healed of her pain. And what you're also going to see is that her prayer also seems to follow the phases of healing that you see in medical textbooks. It's almost like as she prays, she metaphorically progresses through the bleeding phase, the inflammation phase, the proliferation phase, and finally the remodeling phase. Man, I'm working very hard to connect with you guys who work in the medical field. You have no idea how hard I'm working right now. I've never used any of these terms in my life. But there are some similarities. And what I'd like to do this morning is to look together how Hannah's prayer brings about healing and transforms her into a woman of purpose. So let me take you through these together. First, we actually see Hannah praying through the bleeding phase, or the hemostasis phase, or the stage where the bleeding stops. We actually read in verse 9 through 11. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up, and now that Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house, in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. You see, we read in verse 10 how Hannah is bleeding. The verse says, in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. You see, bitterness in the emotional realm is a lot like bleeding. Bitterness is like bleeding because when you're bitter, all your emotional energy gets sapped, and eventually all life is actually lost. In fact, the word anguish in Hebrew here in verse 10 is actually the Hebrew word mar, which means bitter, like in the story of the Exodus. The water of Marah was bitter. And what you'll find interesting later down in verse 16, where Hannah says to Eli the priest, "Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." The word anguish here in verse 16 is actually the Hebrew word for sihah, or for complaint. So this means that Hannah is at the tabernacle of the Lord in Shiloh with a heart that is bitter and a heart that is complaining. But Hannah does something crucial as her first step. Hannah stops the bleeding. As her first crucial step, Hannah stops the bleeding by going directly to the Lord. She goes directly to the Lord. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, saying, this is so elementary and this is so basic, going directly to the Lord. And I say this to the college students a lot, go directly to God. But I want to remind you here that Hannah is acting in an opposite manner compared to the Israelites. She's acting completely opposite to the Israelites. Remember when the Israelites were bitter and complaining people as they're walking through the wilderness, like with the water at Marah or Massah or Meribah, they refused to go directly to the Lord. In fact, you guys know how far Hannah had to walk from Ramah to Shiloh, where the tabernacle of the Lord was actually located? The answer, she had to walk 15 to 20 miles by foot. By the way, this is not flatlands like Houston. Remember, this is the hill country. So this would be 6 hours of walking through the hill country to the place of worship with God. So, man, you think about this, 6 hours walking while bleeding in emotional bitterness. That's a lot to bear. But if you remember the Israelites, they also walked long distances in bitterness in the wilderness. But with their every step, the Israelites become more and more contentious. They become more and more irate, and then they become prideful. The Israelites actually even say to Moses, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die?" But when Hannah gets to the tabernacle after her long walk, Hannah humbles herself and she prays directly before the Lord. She attempts to stop the emotional bleeding. Now also remember that both the Israelites and Hannah are in their situation and circumstance because of God. Let me just say that again. Both the Israelites and Hannah are in their circumstances because of God. God led the Israelites out of Egypt into the wilderness, and God had closed Hannah's womb. And what you need to know is what the Israelites and what Hannah don't know. And that is that God had a purpose for them both. Amen? God had a purpose for both of them, even though they don't know. They just don't know the why. They don't know the why they're in their painful circumstances that they're in. And I think that we can actually learn from these stories that when we don't know the why for our painful circumstance, bitterness will definitely, without a doubt, bitterness will grow. Bitterness will start to grow, and you'll definitely begin to bleed emotionally. And I think that, honestly, from the Bible's perspective, that's okay. Because what's interesting in Exodus 15, when the Israelites had a lack of water, the Lord does not necessarily fault them for initially becoming bitter and complaining. But rather, what the Lord actually faults them on is that they don't stop their bleeding and their complaining. And if you guys remember, as we read from Exodus all the way to Numbers chapter 11 or Numbers chapter 20, 2 books later, the Israelites are still bitter, right, when you get to their story. And then Moses and the Lord, they get angry at the Israelites for their complaints. The Israelites, they never learned how to stop their bitterness along the way. This is crucial. This is absolutely crucial for us to learn. Because in most circumstances, we as Christians often do not find out the why for our pain until much, much later in our lives. We actually don't find out the why for our pain until much later. Not until you look back at your life do you see that hindsight's 20/20 and why you went through what you went through. In fact, in our own lives, for example, Justy and myself, we've been placed in circumstances that we didn't understand until years later. You know, when our son went through severe eczema, or when our house burned down, or we went through other things on top of that. But going through the circumstance at the time was definitely painful. And when we went to the Lord in prayer, you know, God did not just lay out everything very nice and neatly for us. And this is why you're going through what you're going through. All we heard from God was, trust me. That's all we heard from the Lord. Trust me. But now, I kind of see, as I get older, going directly to the Lord and falling before Him in your pain versus running from Him is of utmost importance. It's a sign that you trust Him. It's a sign that you trust Him. And for Hannah, he immediately tries to stop the bleeding as she cries out before the Lord, weeping. Are any of you this morning, bleeding in bitterness? And are any of you trying to attempt to stop the bleeding? Hannah did. And this is what helps her go on to the next phase in her journey. You see, Hannah, in the next phase in her prayer, goes to the inflammation phase. The inflammation phase. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the inflammation phase because you're not a doctor, the inflammation phase destroys the bacteria in the wound that removes the debris with white blood cells. And this phase secretes proteins that attract immune system cells to facilitate tissue repair. At least that's what Google tells me. These are the most medical words I've ever used in my whole entire life in this one sentence, Peter. I've never used medical words like this. You see, instead of allowing the sinful bacteria of self-absorption, of self-pity, and selfishness start to harm her while she's in prayer before God, Hannah goes on the offense. She goes on the offense in her prayer, and she starts to draw on her spiritual white blood cells as she begins to pray boldly to align her desires to God's. How does Hannah go on the offense in her prayer? She does what most people in life can't do. Hannah surrenders her expectations. She surrenders her expectations. Look at what she does in verse 11. Hannah prays, Lord Almighty, if you only look on your servant's misery, and she was miserable, and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Hannah could have prayed, Lord Almighty, if you only give me a son, I will cherish him all the days of my life and will worship you as one family. She could have prayed that. But what's amazing is that Hannah prays in such a way that is not according to her desires, but she prays according to God's will. How? First, Hannah calls herself your servant. She calls herself a servant of God. She sees herself as a servant of the Lord. That's very, very hard to do. When you think of yourself, do you think of yourself as the servant of the Lord? Is that your identity? Next, Hannah makes a vow. I'll give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. Maybe another way to say that is this: not my will, but your will be done, is how Hannah prays. You see, Hannah surrenders. You see, Hannah, like Samson's mother, is committing her potential firstborn son to be a Nazirite. And a Nazirite was a special servant who was dedicated to the Lord's service, if you remember. Hannah was not just giving up Samuel just, 25% or 50% or 75%. She was giving up Samuel 100%. What if during a ministry rush month, if we had a sign up on our church app to offer up your firstborn child to do full-time missions in Syria? Would any of you guys, any takers in the room here? None, probably. You see, imagine Hannah doing that, giving up her first child, who's not even born yet, by the way, up to the Lord for full-time ministry. And the reason this would be hard for you and me to imagine is because we have an expectation. We have this picture in our mind of what our family is supposed to look like now and into the future. I read this quote once, and I really loved it. It says, "What messes me up most in life is the picture in my head of how life is supposed to be." What messes me up most in life is the picture in my head of how life is supposed to be. Have you realized in your life yet why you're not happy? It's because of unmet expectations. You see, ever since you were a young child, you were encouraged to dream big dreams. Big dreams for your life and for your future and for your marriage and for your family. And when your picture in your head does not match your reality, and when those dreams become unrealized and our expectations become unmet, this is when we start to become bitter. But what's amazing here is that Hannah courageously prays in a way where she surrenders her expectations. This is praying with offense. That's what it means to pray with offense. Hannah actually prays according to James 4:2-3. You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask. And when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. Hannah's prayer is not making the gift about the gift, but making the gift about God's will and his purpose. I'm sure that many of you today have something deep in your heart that you want. I'm sure that many of you have this good desire. It's a good desire that lies deep in your heart, and it's a good desire that you want. But do you think that you could pray in such a way that offers that desire up to God and up to his will in your life? The prayer that has changed the trajectory of my life was when I was living in Hefei, China in the summer of 1996. I was on a mission trip with a UT campus ministry there called Campus Crusade for Christ, and I remember praying this very simple prayer as a junior on that particular trip. And I said, "Lord, if you want me to come back to China, I'll come back." And once I prayed that prayer, I thought to myself, "Oh no, what did I just do?" But that prayer changed the trajectory of my life. It taught me how to live by faith. I lived in China for about 4 years. I met my best friend, Justy, there, and my wife. And for you college students, believe it or not, I've learned from my experience in China, I've learned from that experience how to do ministry to many college students in our ministry. I don't think I would have a ministry like this if I had not had that experience there. I believe that this text is asking you, while you're good in your desire, can you offer your prayers up with offense like Hannah did? Prayers that surrenders your expectations to God. The third stage Hannah progresses through is the proliferation phase. And this phase allows for the covering and the filling of wounds. And the wound is cleaned out with connective tissue and blood vessels that form along the bed of the wound. And actually you'll see in verse 12-15, you read this: "As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, 'How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine.' "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord." You know what's interesting to me about this part of the story? Even Eli, who is the priest of the tabernacle, who's actually seen hundreds of people in his life come to the tabernacle, sees that it's weird that Hannah is praying so hard. The text actually says that she was praying in her heart and her lips were moving, but her heart was not heard. Her voice was not heard. I mean, Hannah must have been really praying her heart out in this moment because she looked like she was drunk to Eli the priest. And this means for Eli the priest that this was not very common for people, for regular Jewish people who came to the tabernacle to offer up prayers with a pouring out of one's soul in a sort of way. And Hannah herself even says that she's been pouring out her soul in verse 15. And Hannah here, by the pouring out her soul, we see that she's allowing to fill up her wound. Do you guys know what's very interesting about this phrase, pouring out of one's soul in the Old Testament? This expression was actually used for the very first time in 1 Samuel 15 with Hannah. But this phrase, interestingly, is later picked up in other books like Psalm 62:8 or Lamentations 2:19. And what this means is that Hannah's heartfelt prayer that pours out becomes a model for the Israelites to follow. And this begs the question, when was the last time you had a good pouring out of your soul to God? When was the last time you poured out your soul to Him? And the reason is because when you pour out your soul to God, when you pour out your soul before the Lord, the Holy Spirit comes in to fill up your soul. This is the promise to the Israelites. Like in Joel 2:25-28. If you actually jump down to verse 27, it says, "Then you'll know that I am in Israel, and I am the Lord your God, and that there is no other. Never again will people be ashamed. And afterward, I will pour out my Spirit on all people." In Ephesians 5:18, the Apostle Paul commands us not to be filled with wine, but to be filled with the Spirit. You see, Hannah, she progresses through the proliferation phase by filling up her wound. And now we're going to actually see now the last phase where it overlaps, the last phase, the remodeling phase. And the remodeling phase is where new tissue slowly gains strength and flexibility. And we see this actually in 1 Samuel 16-17. It says, "Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief," Eli answered. "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Note that, favor in your eyes. Then she went on her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Now, what I need you to note about this particular part of the story and what happens is after Hannah poured out her soul, in verse 18 it says, "Then Hannah went on her way, and then she ate something, and that her face was no longer downcast." Did y'all notice how something very peculiar happens here? You see, before, Hannah couldn't eat anything because she was so initially grieved. But now she can go eat something. Hannah was initially so anguished, but the text states that her face was no longer downcast. And what's peculiar here is that Hannah's pain or wound actually almost becomes completely healed. However, she is yet to become pregnant. Nor has she received what she wanted yet. She hasn't gotten pregnant yet. She hasn't received anything from God yet. Her prayers are not answered, but she's almost healed. And what's also very striking, if you don't believe me, is that she says something very peculiar to Eli the priest. Hannah says, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Y'all happen to know what the Hebrew word that Hannah uses for the word favor? Hannah uses the word hen, which comes from her own name, hen. The na part of Hannah is often used for female words, just Hannah, right? Makes it female. In other words, it seems like Hannah is signaling to Eli the priest that she's back. In other words, it seems Hannah very humbly drops the mic in front of Eli the priest. It seems like Hannah says, "May your servant find hen in your eyes," that she's saying, "May your servant find Hannah again in your eyes." I believe that she's actually saying here, okay, I think I'm okay. Have you ever experienced, this type of prayer in your life, in your spiritual life? The type of prayer where you actually get healing from it through God versus God giving you something. Now, mind you again, that this is before Hannah has received anything from the Lord. And what you'll notice in verse 19 through 20, when actually Hannah leaves the temple, that the Lord actually never told her, he never tells her that her prayer will actually come true or that something's going to happen to her. Or in verse 20, when she actually receives the boy, she actually names him Samuel. And the NIV translates Samuel's name to mean, I asked the Lord for him. But this is kind of misleading because the Hebrew is heard of God. Heard of God. And the reason why I think that this is important is because through Hannah's prayer and Samuel's name, Hannah received something just as important as receiving her first child. Hannah received an acknowledgement that she was seen and that she was heard from God himself. And this empowers her to fulfill her purpose. And then starting from verse 21, you're going to see Hannah actually live out her purpose. Watch this. Let me just read the rest of this chapter for you. When her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer annual sacrifices to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I'll take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. Do what seems best to you, her husband Elkanah told her. Stay here until you've weaned him. Only make the Lord make good your word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And now listen to this. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, and with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, Pardon me, my Lord, as surely as I live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he'll be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Let me reiterate verse 28 for you again. So now I give him to the Lord. You see, Hannah's purpose was to give Samuel to the Lord. That was her purpose. And I'm not sure if you guys know this, but Samuel, this child, will actually be the last and the final king for the nation of Israel. And Samuel is the one who will anoint King David to the actual throne, if you remember. Y'all kind of see how Hannah's pain had led her to her purpose? Her pain and wounds led her to her purpose. You see, pain and wounds have purpose in our Christian life. They have purpose. And going back to Jordan Peterson, who criticizes the idea that happiness is the proper goal for life, that the meaning of life has more to do with the developing of character in the face of pain than it does with happiness, I would also add that I think that for a Christian, that the meaning of life has more to do with the development in your trust in God in the face of pain to help lead you to your purpose than it does with happiness. You know, actually, this story reminded me of the story of Jacob when he wrestles the angel. You guys remember that story? He wrestles the angel of the Lord, and the Lord touches his socket, and then his hip gets wrenched, it says in the text, and so he has this permanent limp. You see, what role does his pain play in his walk with God? It was to give him and his people, Israel, the identity to give up their self-reliance and to trust in God. That was the purpose of that painful moment. And I think what we learn here from Hannah's story is that the purpose of pain is for trusting that God our Father works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so that you just don't get confused here, don't get confused and think that God's purpose for you is to be in pain. That's not what the text is trying to say. God's purpose for you is not to be in pain, but is supposed to use that pain for your purpose. I want you guys not to be confused because in the second chapter, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, Hannah has 5 more children in the second chapter. You see, we read in 1 Samuel 2, 20 through 21 that she has 5 more kids. And I believe that if you look at the Bible and through this story, that pain is an invitation to prayer. Pain is an invitation to prayer. Have you ever met anyone in your life who's never gone through any problems or had 0 pain in their life, but had a deep relationship with God? You hardly ever meet people like that. You see, pain is actually an invitation to prayer. And prayer is our relationship with God, through trust, as we trust him. And that prayer proceeds to our purpose. And our purpose proceeds to life, which Hannah actually received. And life in God, along with your family and your friends, that is happiness. This is what I believe the Bible is trying to say through this particular story. The Bible is trying to say that life without God and his calling and his purpose in your life without him is a life without happiness. Do you have purpose in your life today? What's your purpose in your life? And the reason why I know that this is truth and this is biblical is because the story of Hannah is like all stories in the Old Testament. It all points to Jesus and the cross. Jesus endured pain while he trusted the Father in order to fulfill the Father's purpose for conquering death, in order so that we could have life and to call us brothers and sisters into life in a relationship with him. And the text states he did this, according to Hebrews, he endured the cross for the joy set before him as he's exalted to the right hand of God. So, could your pain be an invitation from God? Just like it was to Hannah and just like it was to Jesus. Could your pain be an invitation to trust in your Father so that your Father can work all things for his purpose so that you can have true life? You know, I know that with a crowd this size, that many of you in your life are going through something that might be painful. And God's inviting us who deal with some level of pain into an invitation to a relationship with him. Again, I don't think that this passage is actually about people who cannot get pregnant, but rather this is an invitation for those of us who are struggling in our pain today. That while you're in your pain, this is an invitation from God to transform your pain into purpose. Let's pray together. Father God, I just want to lift up this congregation to you. And I know that many of us, especially here, are definitely going through deep things in our life with you, God. And the pain that we feel is maybe relative. Maybe the bleeding is smaller compared to others. But Lord, I know, God,